Yesterday, I was listening to a preacher, and he mentioned the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And like every other time I've heard a preacher talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they gave a incorrect interpretation. And I'm going to explain why I believe their interpretation is incorrect and why it's actually really important to understand what's incorrect about the interpretation. So, what he said was that the reason that God didn't want Adam and Eve to eat of the knowledge of good and evil is because he wanted them to choose revelation over reason. So, I've heard this before from other Christian preachers and authors that God actually doesn't really care about reason, or, rationality isn't really what God is about. And they say this as if it's complimentary. They say this as if it's a form of praise to say that God is irrational. The correct interpretation of the story of the knowledge of good and evil is that the devil was on that tree and he corrupted that knowledge. It's not that God doesn't want us to know the difference between right and wrong. The story is about corrupted knowledge of good and evil, right? And I've never heard any preacher say this, right? None of your Pauline preachers, as far as I know, as far as I've ever heard, they never communicate this correct interpretation, which is that it was a corrupted knowledge of good and evil. And two main interpretations that I hear all the time. One is that it's not even about good and evil. It was just about obedience, right? The preacher will just put aside the whole good and evil thing as if that's irrelevant. It could have been about anything. It could have been the tree of, you know, um, coffee and chocolate or whatever. It doesn't, it could have been the tree of just apples or oranges. It doesn't matter. It was about obedience. And so they'll just go on about how it was the act of disobedience that caused the fall of man. As if it's not really about the knowledge of good and evil. Don't worry about that. It's about obedience. That's all the story is about. Simple as that. They reduce it to simply God asked Adam to do something, or he asked him to not do something, and he did it anyway. And that's the problem. They just simplify it to that. As if, like I said, morality, good and evil, not actually part of the story, not actually important. The other main way that this story is usually interpreted is as I was saying, which is that they will address the issue of good and evil, but they address it by saying that it's basically irrelevant, and they'll even equate such knowledge with reason, right? As the preacher I heard yesterday did. And they'll say, God doesn't want you to partake or ingest this reason, this reasoning, and instead wants you to just live by revelation. So God was saying, don't follow false morality. That is the interpretation that you've probably never heard before, but that's the correct interpretation of the story. It's not that God doesn't care about good and evil, which is just ridiculous. I mean, if you just think about it for a second, like, well, what was the Ten Commandments all about? And why was Jesus constantly talking about morality and the greatest commandments and love? When we follow a false morality, we are misled, and that leads to a negative consequence, as illustrated by Adam and Eve being cast out of paradise, right? So, what is false morality? Previously, I've talked about the false morality being a backwards morality, right? It's this completely inverted sense of right and wrong. You think the good is bad, and you think the bad is good, right? So the examples I gave before, for example, of like inherited sin, you believe that this doctrine is actually good, and you believe that if you believe humans are inherently evil, that that's good, that you're exercising humility, right? So it's completely backwards. The truth is, it's a demonic teaching, I would say. It's a satanic teaching. It's completely false. And not only is it completely false, it's completely immoral, right? It's this slanderous view towards humanity, right? You're saying all of humanity is inherently evil. But, if you've been programmed by this false teaching, your mind is probably going to immediately, just as I say those words, your mind probably immediately went to, well, it's just so that we orient ourselves correctly to Jesus, right? Something like that. Well, no, it's just because we need to humble ourselves, right? You're so programmed by this false morality that you can't see that it's false. You just think, well, no, it's humility. It's humility to be slanderous towards humanity. I mean, that's what it is fundamentally, that's the delusion you've been programmed to believe by, nice looking and sounding preachers for decades, that if you believe your heart is inherently evil, you're on the right track. You've taken the first step towards salvation, right? You've humbled yourself sufficiently. It sounds kind of legit, right? Like, well, maybe that is the first step to salvation. Maybe I do have to recognize that I'm just inherently evil and a worthless sinner, and every newborn baby is just awful. And yeah, I guess we all did just inherit this from an ancestor, even though that doesn't really make sense that, for example, I would inherit the sins of my father, my biological father. If my biological father committed a crime, it doesn't make sense that I would have to go to jail for the crime he committed. But nevertheless, it sounds like it's humility, so I'm just going to go with it. Right? And forgive me for laughing, but it really is ridiculous, and it's sad. It's no laughing matter whatsoever. It's sad because it's tragic in that it's sabotage. It's pure sabotage to your actual salvation. So that's one form of false morality. Morality that's backwards, where you think the good is bad and the bad is good. But there's a couple of other forms of false morality. One being what you could call nihilism, where the belief that there is no good or bad, right? So it's not that your morality is backwards, it's that you just disregard morality altogether. You just think there is no real right or wrong. And you'll find this oftentimes in what's called like New Age teachings or spiritual teachings. Well, they'll even romanticize the idea of it's a romanticized nihilism. There's also like a famous line in a poem, I think it's by the guy Rumi, where he says something like, I'll meet you in a field beyond good and evil. Like, let's meet there, and oh, it'll be heavenly, right? It's this romanticized beyond good and evil. Like, oh, we're so enlightened that we don't even consider good and evil anymore, right? It's delusional, right? It's completely delusional. It's a false morality. So, that's one form of false morality, is this, there is no morality. You could call it an amorality, right? So we have the backwards morality, and then we have the non-existent morality. And then finally, we have the moral relativism. This is where the person doesn't have disregard for morality altogether, right? They're not falling into the New Age nihilist camp. And they're not falling into the completely backwards morality where they think the bad is good and the good is bad. They think that there is good and bad, but sometimes the bad is actually good. It just depends on the situation, right? And so I think this is where actually most people fall under. This is the camp that most people belong to, whether they realize it or not. Most people aren't complete nihilists, or off in this New Age dreamland where they think there's no right and wrong whatsoever. And most people don't subscribe to like a completely backwards morality, which would be Satanism, actually, where they think, abuse is good. Most people fall into this middle camp, which is there is good and bad, but it's relative. It depends. Maybe coercing people to take drugs is bad most of the time, but if there's a crisis, oh well, then I think it could be okay under certain limited conditions, yada yada yada, right? So it's relative. Abuse is okay sometimes, right? Preemptive attack is okay sometimes, right? Normally, it's not legitimate to attack someone first just because you think they might harm you or someone else. But maybe sometimes it is legitimate. We gotta be a realist and we gotta recognize that sometimes we might actually have to commit violence in order to make the world a better place, right? This is actually, I think, where most people, like I said, fall under as far as a false morality. They think it's like the most intelligent, right? They've been deceived into thinking that wisdom is moral relativism, right? Like you often hear people speak like disparagingly, like they'll speak down to the idea of like anyone who has like a clear black and white morality. Like they'll, roll their eyes at them and be like, oh, you know, they have this limited perception, they can't see the bigger picture. And so they think they're wise, they think they're intelligent by holding to this moral relativism, when in fact they're foolish. In fact, they're incorrect, and there is a clear black and white morality. Only that abuse is always evil under all circumstances for all time, no matter what the scenario or crisis, always evil, 100%, right? They're never going to just accept that because they bought into this delusion of moral relativism, this false morality, and look where that's actually led humanity, right? So it's another false morality that is deceptive and it's sabotage and takes us out of paradise, right? There is actually a clear-cut morality, right? It's the greatest commandments to love God, others, and ourselves. The opposite of loving someone is abusing them. Abuse is pure evil. No exceptions. Jesus didn't say, well, unless there's a natural disaster, like, oh, if there's a hurricane coming or a tornado, well, you can put the greatest commandments to the side and exercise emergency powers, right? Of course, he never said that, right? Because it would sound ridiculous to even suggest that he would say such a thing. And that's because it's false. It's a false morality. But that's exactly what people think. They think basically that, the teaching of Jesus is naive, right? They think like, or to believe in the teaching of Jesus is naive, right? Like if you think like, oh, love is the answer and that's it, well, that's nice, but you're naive. You're not in the real world, right? In the real world, sometimes we actually have to be abusive in order to set things right. If you're defending yourself or your family or someone else, you're not being abusive. Quite the opposite. You're actually exercising love. So, again, everything is backwards. They're telling you that abuse is love and love is abuse. But to just reiterate so that there's no confusion here, there's three forms of false morality that lead to humanity's destruction. We could say the first one is a non-morality or an amorality, this new age or nihilist view that there's no good or bad. And then the other extreme being that you believe there's good and evil, but you're all about the evil, right? You just think actually evil is good. And then there's the third form, which is the moral relativism, which is that there is good and bad, but sometimes bad is good. And the interesting thing to observe when you see that there's these three forms is there a relationship to, or the parallel to electricity and current and power, right? In the Taoist tradition, the most famous book, I believe it's the most translated book in the world, most various translations, second only to the Bible. It's a book called the Tao Te Ching. And the word day in the middle, oftentimes spelled T-E, or more appropriately in English, D-E, but sounds like day, like, day and night, sounds like the word day. It means virtue power. So there's this idea of virtue and power being interconnected. Gandhi had an idea of satyagraha, which is like truth force. So it's this idea that morality or virtue actually has power to it, right? So returning to this context of the knowledge of good and evil that fits into three categories, you could think of the nihilist view as like the power being off. It's like the switch is off. You're not exercising this current at all. There's zero currency, right? Zero moral currency, zero power, right? So it's like the engine or the motor being turned off, right? Zero current. And then the completely backwards morality would be a completely negative current, right? Pure negative charge, which, as we're familiar with in human life, right? Like that's dangerous, right? Like electricity can actually kill you, right? It's this, you could say there's power to it, but it's it's a destructive power, right? So completely negative charge. And then the moral relativism is actually when the positive and the negative are combined, right? You believe in good and bad, but you think that they're basically interchangeable. And so this is neutral, right? This is a neutralized or grounded current, right? So when the current is neutral, it's, this combination of positive and negative, which neutralize one another. So I just share that observation to maybe help you remember and understand, these three forms of false morality. Again, the no current being the nihilism, the new age, no good or bad. The completely negative current being the completely backwards or satanic morality. And then moral relativism being this positive and negative combined into a worthless, neutral current or energy that is also destructive, right? All three are destructive, right? All three serve the devil. All three are false morality that the devil wants us to follow because it takes us away this understanding that, again, the correct interpretation of the story of the knowledge of good and evil is that it was a corrupted knowledge, and that's why the devil was on that tree, or, the snake was on the tree with the apples. And you can even make it more clear to yourself by imagining the snake in the apple or the worm in the apple, being that the knowledge of good and evil was corrupted, right? And then they ate that corrupted knowledge. They believed the false morality, and that led to their downfall. So they could never go to the tree of life, right, where satisfaction is gained. Because that's the whole thing. We do actually have to follow the correct morality to have a satisfying life. Like that's the main lesson. And that's why God and Jesus were so adamant about trying to clarify to us what's right and wrong so that we would choose it under our own free will. We would choose the right and reject the wrong so that we could be in alignment with his will, right? This is a perfectly good divinity. He's not going, he can't, I think it's correct to say he can't actually, reward evil. It's against his nature, right? So, yes, he continuously offers us new opportunities to get it right. He continuously is forgiving in that way, but we still got to get it right. It's not like whether we get it right or not is irrelevant, right? Jesus said to sin no more. He said to be perfect like our Heavenly Father is perfect, right? He said to obey me is to follow my commandments, to love me is to follow my commandments. So that's the main thing to understand as far as like the big picture metaphysics of morality is we actually do have to get our morality straight in order to eat of the tree of life, symbolically representing like a satisfying life, right? And not symbolically paradise, right? A better society. In order to return to that, we do need to get our right and wrong straight. And if you believe in nihilism or you believe in moral relativism or you believe in a completely backwards morality, that's not going to happen. Those are the three forms of the corrupted knowledge of good and evil, that if you eat those, if you believe those, you're going to be cast out of paradise, right? So that's why we got to actually